Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Context is King. I'm Rebecca Brayton, and with me as always is WatchMojo founder and CEO Ashkan Karbasfrooshan to discuss public speaking, which I don't like doing. Do you like doing it?
As a masochist, there's a certain rush you get from it, but it's definitely, there's something about it, this like anxiety that builds up like the day before, the day of. But I won't lie, like being in front of an audience and seeing their reaction and trying to engage people is an interesting endeavor.
Interesting, that's the word. So you did a live show, and you used to do a radio show. So how did those compare?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is always that you're telling a story and breathing is good and pausing is good and kind of like framing it and asking the right questions and, you know, spacing. It's very different in that, like the radio show, you're kind of alone and the audience is out there. I think when you do a live show on YouTube with the comments and all that, because of that aspect, I mean, let alone the fact that you're also visually out there, but I think when you're doing a live show that also has the real-time dynamic, it's kind of like it leaves a bit less to the imagination, so you have to really focus to the audience. That's the one thing that's common, is ultimately you can't think about too many variables. You're just having a conversation with the audience.
So that compared to public speaking now?
Yeah, so public speaking, what I like is you feed off the audience in terms of eye movements, eye contacts. If the audience is out, you kind of know how to adjust. I do generally, I mean, I think where I learned a lot from public speaking was when I was a teacher's assistant. I was actually lecturing undergrad, master's, and PhD students at both Concordia, John Molson School of Business, and McGill, even though I wasn't supposed to, because I wasn't like a master's student. It was just, I was helping out some teachers. And they asked some really tough questions, and you know, they're there to get good grades, and they're gonna ask you things that they're not comfortable necessarily asking the teacher. So that was like a really, really good exercise. But so, you know, it's hard, but I personally just do get a rush out of it, and it's not that different than if you are, not that I'm a musician, but like a musician that gets on stage to perform or an actor that gets on stage to perform. You are conveying an emotion to your audience through words, through a story, through imagery, and to be able to captivate people when they are easily, especially in this era, distracted. I think that's a high. And I think anybody that kind of says, oh, I do public speaking, but I don't enjoy it or whatever, is either lying or then they shouldn't be doing it. You do have to kind of like that. And for me, it's like that masochism of you're putting yourself through this certain rigorous exercise and to come out on top and win over the audience.
Right. Is there like a format you think is easier than another, or that you prefer, like moderating or like being a panelist, or?
I like it all because it's a very different dynamic. I mean, obviously I've moderated a lot of panels, and I think there the key is research, where you are asking questions and knowing who to ask what, and then crowd control. You know, there's always going to be one person that's going to be more domineering, and you want to kind of like make sure you ask like everybody adds so that the sum of the parts is highest. I also like being a panelist because then you could just kind of like let everybody do their thing and then come out with a line or two that, not for shock value, but
I think being a panelist is easiest.
Being a panelist is far and away the easiest. The Q&A is interesting because I think that's actually for me really easy, because ultimately people are not asking me about neuroscience, they're asking me about like 5 things in different ways, and it's an area that
that's what we're doing.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
It's like I have domain expertise, and it's like, so that I'm really comfortable. I think a lot of people underestimate how hard it is to be a good interviewer. As an interviewer, when you're asking the questions, I feel...
Interviewer
even,
okay.
Because you really have to research, but you also have to shut the There are so many people, and it's natural. They're like, yeah, and then they interrupt. And it's human nature, So, very Canadiana there. No, but it's human nature, and that's why I'm always like, wow. So sometimes when I'm in that role, and I've also interviewed 500 people, and sometimes on a telephone where you don't see the body language or they're starting to talk, so you have to have kind of this. The hardest one to me is the keynote. The keynote is like the filet mignon, is like, that is the hardest one. It's the most nerve-wracking. And you're ultimately, it's like, when you give a keynote, you're not actually talking about what you're talking about. it's like those are details, but you're telling a story. And it's a story you've crafted over time. So when I'm talking about the WatchMojo experience, it's not about the WatchMojo
It's like a comedy
experience.
routine almost.
There you go. It's a story of persistence because the audience will relate to persistence. It's a story of, like, say, timing and luck and, like, your fans and your critics and your insecurities. You're relating things that you've done, but that they can take away from it. So that they basically put down their phone, look at you, and you see in the eyes, and you're like, that's the rush. Why you do that? So what I tell people, though, is I go, that doesn't mean you can just show up and tell your life story. Sometimes there's too many details. The timing, putting the right emphasis on the wrong syllable can kill you. So it is very much like a comedy routine. Jokes. There's a few jokes that I always make because they work. We didn't invent the top 10 list. Letterman, Wayne's World, Moses, the OG of... works every time, right? People have seen it, like they probably heard me saying it, but and that's also the thing is, even if you are, whoever, Tony Robbins, Bill Gates, and you've spoken and there's still, in any given audience, 80, 90% have never really heard what you've got to say. So that's also like, finding what works, working on the routine, but practice. I'm not a guy that does a lot of practice, but I've learned not to. Ouch. But I've learned, like, timing. Don't just show up and thinking that you could just fake it. I learned a great lesson from, you probably follow him on Twitter if you just follow sports. So Arash Madani, who I think is on Sportsnet now, Rogers Media property. So I used to do, when I was doing at the time it was Team 990, now it's Team 690, a Bell Media property. So
is it the team at all? I don't think it is.
It's not even the team?
I don't think
It's not the team?
TSN 690. That's
TSN
what it is.
690. Thank you. I'm aging myself. But so I remember I would show up and I would kind of like wing it. That's not true. I would prepare. But let's say for an hour show, I'd prepare 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Arash would prepare 3 hours for a 1 hour show, to give you an idea. And he was such a pro that I remember kind of going like, okay, I get it. He's going to have a very successful career at this, and he does. He's now, you'll see him at the Super Bowl, you'll see him at the F1, you'll see him everywhere. And I was like, I'm going to be, and I'm not saying this at all in a bad way, I'm going to be the guy running the organization that looks for guys like this. Right? The same thing when I first met you, I was like, Rebecca is exactly what we need for that role. So it takes a lot of preparation.
I think he told me he was going to be my boss just then, but that's fair.
I'm not the boss.
I do
work
a lot
for you
of
guys,
research now.
and that's not like bullshit. I do believe that. You guys are my boss. But the point is, when I saw the amount of work that Arash would put into his craft, it gave me a lot of appreciation. And like I up once. I messed up, but in my mind, it was like very limited. So I remember when I was in business school, I was prepping for whether it was the Commerce Games or the Business Games, whatever that thing was. And so I was a very good student, but I was working. I never really studied. And so I was like, okay, it's like a presentation and it's like problem solving. So I show up, they give me the paper, I look at it and I come in and I just kind of like explain it. But I made a mistake that was like probably not a big deal. But instead of kind of like relying on my communication, presentation, kind of command of the audience and room, I kind of went deeper into covering the mistake, fixing the mistake real time. Now, there is something that threw me off, which was school's a big bullshit. Like, there's always bullshit in politics. So I was thrown off by the fact that one of the contestants to be part of the Commerce Games was also a judge. So I remember going like, this is kind of a conflict of interest. Like, I'm guessing he's going to... So that threw me off because I was like, why is this guy a judge if he's like, Anyway, all good. But so that threw me off, not as an excuse. So the whole time I was like, this seems rather not like rigged. It seems not right. But it doesn't matter. I still made a mistake. But because I set the bar too high. This was like a couple teachers and a couple classmates. It was clearly already decided who would be going and not. But instead of just kind of being like, look, let me show them that I could be a good yin to the yang of the team, I want to show them that I'm like a master of finance, which was setting the bar too high. So whenever I go up to present at like, let's say VidCon, at NatP, or go to speak in front of like, let's say hundreds of people, a few times even thousands of people that I've done it, I go, Ash, most of these people are not even going to be listening to you. You're not going there to woo them with like lessons of life that make them come up to you and shake their hand and be like, you shared my life. I go, at best, you want to get their attention, retain their attention, and let them leave with one thing that they can apply and be like, this helped me. That's a pretty low bar to set if you think about it. And you go there almost with like no pressure. And that generally works. And whenever somebody goes up there and they go, do you have an advice? I go, that last part, basically.
Right. Well, do you have any other tips for public speaking?
There's a lot. I do think ultimately it just goes down to what's the story you're telling and why are you uniquely positioned to share that story? And then what's the takeaway people have? I think if you focus on those three things, it's easy to deliver.
Can you get specific though?
Sure. So when I'm coordinating the details, the first question people ask me sometimes is like, I have notes here. They go, do you want to stand behind a podium or do you want to walk around? So I like both. I think it's like when I'm speaking in front of a classroom, I like the podium, especially if I have notes. But if I'm telling a story, I do like to walk around because then I can also get closer and like engage with audience members instead of just standing there like a stiff. That's one. Two, if you really want the audience to take things away, I think statistics work a lot. I think quotes work a lot. I think anything that's data. Obviously, less is more. If you have like a presentation and a deck, don't fill it up with like font 12, 15 lines of text. I like the whole an image, a word, and then you draft off that and go a little bit. Now, you can
this is for a very specific type of public speaking.
This is for specific.
Because I feel like stats are not necessarily going to work in every context.
Well, when I say stats, I really mean more mix it up between words, numbers, images. Like, don't just give 16 anecdotes of your life story growing up in like a farm in Nebraska. You do need to kind of be like, did you know that 16% of people never, spend an hour in class? Really? I didn't know that. And then why is that pertinent? Ultimately, you got to mix it up, right? It can't be monotonous. And then ultimately, look, you're building some kind of emotional connection between what you're conveying and what the audience is receiving. If there's no emotional connection, I feel that's the bigger thing. Like, everything can be emotional, but obviously, if you are like giving a presentation at like the American Association of, latex salespeople, it's a very different like weight of what you're using than if you're talking about, the Cancer Association of America. Like you're clearly like relying on different tools. But ultimately, it's like, how do you adapt and how do you make that relevant to the audience? Because nobody's really there, believe it or not, for you. They're there to take something away and apply it to their life.
Right. All right. Those are some good public speaking tips. Do you guys have any good public speaking tips? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you next time.